I've often wished for a time machine, a DeLorean, I think. I wanted a way to go back into the past and observe what things were like before my time, or relive those times I'd loved. One thing I'd always yearned for was to see my parents grow up. I'd heard stories, of course, snippets in time. I knew their journey had been harsh, but I also knew it had been amazing. At some level, I think I always felt this longing, this need to watch my dad as he first learned how to survive and then learned how to live. I wanted to see them at that amazing moment when the 1936 Washington varsity crew finally comes together and the boat explodes with power. To watch them race, not just glean what I could from some flickering black and white newsreels, but to see it in full color, to hear it. I guess what I really wanted was to fully understand the experience and live it with Dad. I'd always wanted that, but of course it wasn't possible. Until I met Daniel James Brown. In 2004, when my dad turned 90, he finally had to sell his house. And while my daughter and sister were cleaning out the attic, they came across a trove of rowing memorabilia. There were scrapbooks, newspaper articles, postcards, rowing shirts, train schedules, an amazing assortment of stuff from my dad's university years. My daughter, Jennifer, immediately realized the historical importance of these materials, and she took on the task of archiving everything into a chronological and narrated scrapbook. I'd always known that there was a story to be told about my dad and the crew, but I guess I always felt it was big enough and important enough that one of the many people who came buzzing around Dad and the guys over the years and interviewing them would eventually write something, and that would take care of it. But the years passed, and nothing happened. And those men who had held the history were dying off. And I could feel the threads of the story slipping away. And then I saw what Jennifer had put together, and the vision of how to approach writing the story became much more clear. I began to wonder whether I was the person to preserve the legend. And so I set out on a mission with Dad to collect up whatever odds and ends of memories he happened to spontaneously think about. In a sense, I followed him around with a pad and pencil for over 3 years. And so when a request came to Dad from a history teacher in Indiana, I wrote up a 9-page synopsis of Dad's life and the crew's history that looked pretty good. I was beginning to think I might write the story. In the meantime, Daniel James Brown moved into our neighborhood. I'd met him a number of times at our homeowners association meetings, and he was in the process of writing his first book. And when it was published in 2006, he encouraged us to buy it and read it with the promise that he would sign it. Well, I bought it. I read it under a flaming sky, and it transported me back to Hinckley, Minnesota, into the middle of a raging firestorm in 1894. I could see the town. I could hear the roar of the approaching fire. I could practically feel the flames licking at the windows of the train as it attempted to outrun the inferno. And it hit me. I didn't need a time machine. The answer was staring me right in the face. Okay, so there were a few questions to be answered. Would Dad feel like I did about the way Dan writes a story? Would he even agree to have his story written? Would Dan want to write it? Could he transport me into Dad's past the way he transported me into that firestorm in Hinckley? And the answer to all those questions eventually was yes. Now, I will have to admit a couple of things. First, that when I started this whole mission, my motives were basically selfish. I didn't want Dad's memory forgotten. I didn't want what those boys had accomplished forgotten. And I suppose I also hope that the examples of what they had had to go through might make some people stop and consider whether their own situation was really all that tough. Second, I had no inkling of the journey that Dan and I would be embarking on. I'm not even sure he realized completely where we were headed. It was pretty much a 6-year odyssey of research and writing, of outreach and questions and discoveries, because in order to make the story live, the boys had to be in a background that the reader understood. In order to get the full gut-wrenching impact of it, you had to feel like you were there with Joe and the boys. You had to feel as though you were seeing what they saw, taking the journey with them. And that is Dan's gift to me, to all of us. I want to read to you a small section from one of the classic races in the book. This is spring of 1936, and this is the IRA Regatta, the race which was, at the time, the equivalent of a National College Championship, 4 miles long for the varsity, and rowed on the Hudson River in Poughkeepsie, New York. Bobby Mock, the coxswain, has been told not to let the other boats get more than 2 lengths ahead and to start moving up on them as they approach the 2-mile marker. They are now approaching the 3-mile marker, and they are 4 lengths behind the leader. Things are definitely not going according to plan, and the coach, Al Ulbrichtson, the man with the stone face, is beginning to crack. In the press car, a hush had gradually fallen over the Washington contingent of writers and coaches as they had taken in just how far behind the Husky Clipper was. People began to murmur, "Come on, Bobby, take it up, take it up." Al Ulbrichtson was silent, calm, sphinx-like, slowly working the gum in his mouth. Any moment now, he figured Bobby Mock would make his move, just as they'd planned. He stared even more intently across the river as the growing darkness began to envelop the shell. All one could really see of Washington were the white tips of their blades, appearing and disappearing rhythmically in the water, still at a nice, leisurely 28. Bobby Mock still hadn't altered the beat at all. He was still 4 lengths back. In the press car, Al Ulbrichtson began to grow uneasy. Mock had been told not to let the leaders get more than 2 lengths ahead, and he was twice that far behind. And he was supposed to have started moving by now. This was most definitely not the race plan that Mock had been given. Tom Bowles and George Pocock sat down, looking morose. It was starting to look like a case of suicide. But out on the water, Bobby Mock told Don Hume, "Take your time. We can catch those boys any time we want." As they passed the 2.5-mile mark, it was essentially the same story. California and Navy were far out in front with Columbia trailing them. Washington had eased past a weakening Penn crew, but remained a devastating 4 lengths back. Ulbrichtson still didn't flinch. He just continued to stare out the window at the flickering white blades on the water, chewing his gum. But he had begun to slump in his seat. He couldn't believe what was happening. What on earth was Mock doing? Why in God's name didn't he turn them loose? In the boat, Bobby Mock took a look at the 4 lengths between his bow and California's stern and hollered to his crew, "Okay, you lugs, we're 1 length behind." As the Washington boat swept under the black skeleton of the railroad bridge at the 3-mile mark, it was still nearly 3 lengths back with a mile to go. The leaders had slowed just a bit, and that had narrowed the gap, but if Mock had raised the rate at all, it was imperceptible. The Washington boys were rowing as if in a kind of a trance now, somehow detached from themselves and yet keenly aware of one another's every minute motion. There was little sound out in the middle of the river, except for Mock's chanting, the rattle of the oars in the oarlocks, and their own deep rhythmic breathing, their pulses pounding in their ears. There was, almost, no pain. In the number 5 seat, Stub McMillan realized with astonishment that he was still breathing through his nose after 3 full miles of rowing. On the train, Al Ulbrichson had all but given up. "They're too far behind," he muttered. "They're overplaying their hand. We'll be lucky to finish 3rd. Ulbrichson's face was ashen. It seemed to have turned entirely to stone. He'd even stopped chewing his gum. In the lane nearest to him, California had powered back out in front, rowing beautifully. With a tiring field behind them and less than a mile to go, Cal was in a commanding position to win. Kai Bright, it seemed, had somehow outwitted him again. But if anybody had outwitted Al Ulbrichson, it was his own coxswain, the short kid with his own Phi Beta Kappa key, and now he would show his hand. Suddenly he leaned into Don Hume's face and bellowed, "Give me 10 hard ones for Ulbrichson." 8 long spruce oars bowed in the water 10 times. And then Mock bellowed again, "Give me 10 more for Pocock." Another 10 enormous strokes. Then another lie. "Here's California, we're on them. 10 more big ones for Mom and Dad." And very slowly the Husky Clipper slipped past Columbia and began to creep up on Navy in second. Someone on the train idly remarked, "Well, Washington is picking up." A minute later, someone else called out much more urgently, "Look at Washington! Look at Washington! Here comes Washington!" On the train and on shore, all eyes shifted from the leaders to the 8 white blades barely visible out in the middle of the river. Another deep, guttural roar began to rise from the crowd. It seemed impossible for Washington to close the gap. They were a half-mile from the finish now, still in 3rd place, still 2 lengths back, but they were moving, and the way they were moving compelled immediate and absolute attention. In the boat, Mock was incandescent. "Okay, now," he barked. And Don Hume took the stroke up to 35, then to 36, then to 37. On the starboard side, Joe Rance fell in behind him just as smooth as silk. The boat began to swing. The bow began to rise out of the water. Washington slid past the middies as if the Navy boat were pinned to the water. Cal's coxswain, Grover Clark, glanced across the river, and for the first time since he'd left it behind at the starting line, he saw the Washington boat sweeping up on his stern. Stunned, he bellowed at his crew to pick it up, and Cal's rate climbed quickly to 38. Mock hollered at Hume to take it up another notch, and Washington went to 40. The rhythm of the California boat seemed to waver and then grow erratic. California and Washington careened into the last 500 yards, storming down the corridor of open water between the spectator boats. People in the rowboats were standing up now, risking a dunking to see what was happening. Some of the large excursion steamers began to list toward the center of the river as people crowded their rails. The roar of the crowd began to engulf the oarsmen. Boat whistles shrieked. On the float in front of Washington Shell House, Evanna Calamar, the crew's cook, waved a frying pan over her head, whooping and urging the boys on. In Washington's press car, pandemonium broke out. George Varnell of the Seattle Times shoved his press credentials into his mouth and began to devour them. Tom Bowles commenced beating a stranger on the back with his lucky old fedora. Royal Brougham was shouting, "Come on, Washington, come on!" Only Al Ulbrichson remained motionless and silent, still riveted to his seat, his eyes cold gray stones locked on the white blades out in the river. Joe Williams of the World Telegram stole a glance at him and thought, "This guy has ice water in his veins." With the finish line looming ahead of him in the gathering dark, Bobby Mock screamed something inarticulate. Johnny White in the number 3 seat suddenly had the sensation they were flying now, not rowing. Stub McMillan desperately wanted to peek, to glance over toward lane 1 where he knew California would be, but he didn't dare. In number 6, over the crowd noise, Shorty Hunt could hear someone on the radio yelling frantically. He tried to make out the words, but all he could tell was that something terribly exciting was happening. He had no idea how things stood, except that he still hadn't seen the California boat fall into his field of view. He kept his eyes locked on the back of Joe Rance's neck and pulled with his whole heart. And then, in the last 200 yards, thinking itself fell away, and pain suddenly came shrieking back into the boat, descending on all of them at once, searing their legs, their arms, their shoulders, clawing at their backs, tearing at their hearts and lungs as they desperately gulped at the air. And in those last 200 yards, in an extraordinary burst of speed, rowing at 40 strokes per minute, pounding the water into a froth, Washington passed California. With each stroke, the boys took their rivals down by the length of another seat, and by the time the two boats crossed the line, in the last vestiges of twilight, a glimmer of open water showed between the stern of the Husky Clipper and the bow of the California Clipper. In the press car, the corners of Al Ulbrichtsen's mouth twitched reluctantly into something vaguely resembling a smile. He resumed chewing his gum, slowly and methodically. Standing next to him, George Pocock threw back his head and howled like a banshee. Tom Bowles continued to flog the back of the fellow in front of him with his old fedora. George Parnell removed the well-masticated remains of his press credentials from his mouth. In Seattle, Hazel Ulbrichtsen and her son Al pounded the glass top of their coffee table until it shattered into dozens of pieces. Up on the automobile bridge, Mike Bogle had the distinct pleasure of setting off 7 bombs in rapid succession. And in the boat, the boys pumped their fists into the dark night air. For a long while, Ulbrichtsen just sat there, staring into the darkness, as fans came rushing through the car, congratulating him and slapping him on the back. When he finally stood up, reporters crowded around him, and he said simply, "Well, they made it close, but they won." Then he elaborated. I guess that little runt knew what he was doing. In our current world, where national teams are made up of oarsmen and women throughout the country, and where college teams are regularly made up of people recruited throughout the world, it is an almost inconceivable thought that the 9 boys in the Husky Clipper all came from Western Washington, and that none had set foot in a racing shell before they arrived on campus. So let's take a look at who the boys were and where they came from. I'll begin with the 4 that came from Seattle. At bow was Roger Morris. Roger grew up in the Fremont district, about 2.5 miles west of the university. Like many others, his family had been solid middle class until the Great Depression. They still held on to their family-owned moving business, but life was now a struggle. Roger earned his tuition money playing in a dance band. In the number 2 seat was Chuck Day. He was probably the most financially stable of the group. His home was just a few blocks north of the university campus. His father was a dentist, and as my dad observed, Chuck was the best-dressed guy of the lot. So why did he turn out for crew? Maybe to follow in the footsteps of his older brother Herb, who had rowed varsity a few years earlier. But I suspect it was just because he loved a challenge. Anyone who would voluntarily choose to work a summer on a job as tough and dangerous as the Grand Coulee Dam had to have the tenacity of a bulldog. In seat number 4 was Johnny White. He grew up in South Seattle along Lake Washington. His family was one of the many who had lost most everything in the Depression. When he graduated from high school, 2 years early, where his only extracurricular activity had been playing violin in the school orchestra, he was neither fully grown nor fully filled out. If he was to fulfill his father's dream for him and become an oarsman, he needed to put on both years and muscle, and somehow earn the money for tuition before he approached the university. And so, after 2 years of heavy labor on the docks and at a lumber yard, he arrived at the University of Washington, tall, fully muscled, and with tuition money enough to keep him in school, at least for a while. In seat number 5 was Jim Stub McMillan. Stub grew up in Seattle on Queen Anne Hill. From early on, his life outside school was taken up with whatever odd jobs he could find, mowing lawns, raking leaves, weeding gardens, running a paper route, and the like. He'd never had a chance to turn out for sports. He often saw the crews rowing on Lake Union while he was out working, and gradually was filled with a fierce determination that one day he would row in one of those shells. When he finally had enough money saved to cover a year's tuition, he enrolled at the university and headed for the shell house. The other 5 boys were spread throughout western Washington. Gordy Adam, in the number 3 seat, grew up on a dairy farm in the small town of Everson near the Canadian border. He had attended a 2-room schoolhouse and then a more modern high school in nearby Deming where he played football. He had to spend 5 months salmon fishing in the brutal waters off the Alaskan coast to earn money to start at the university. Once on campus, he tried out for football as a walk-on, but quickly realized that college-level football was a different animal than the small-town football, and he would get nowhere. So he tried out for crew. It was, as he would later say, a very good fit. At stroke was Don Hume. He hailed from Anacortes, a lumber town and fishing port 50 miles north of Seattle. When his father lost his job at the lumber mill and the family moved to Olympia in search of work, Don stayed with family friends to finish high school. After graduation, he worked for a year at the pulp mills, but when his job gave out, he took a rowboat that he had found and refurbished and rowed the roughly 100 miles to his family in Olympia. A 6-day trip. In the fall, he registered at the university. In seat number 7 was my dad, Joe Rance. Joe was listed as a Seattle boy by the university and in news publications because he graduated from Roosevelt High in Seattle. But his heart, and the only place that had ever felt like home to him, were out on the Olympic Peninsula in Sequim. Hard work to survive on his own had been his lot for much of his life. He'd taken a year after high school, working back in Sequim, to earn enough money to put himself through the first year of college. And I suppose it didn't hurt that his fiancée, my mom, was also in Sequim, finishing up her senior year. So by the fall of 1933, when both he and my mom enrolled at the university, he was well-muscled and hungry for whatever life had to offer. In seat number 6 was Shorty Hunt. Shorty skipped 2 years of high school, graduating from the small farming community of Puyallup at the age of 16. Already 6'3" and an exceptional athlete, he enrolled at the university that fall, the youngest boy to make the crew. The youngest boy each year he was on the team. Shorty celebrated his 20th birthday on the day of opening ceremonies at the Olympics. The coxswain was Bob Mock. The only senior in the boat, Bob had grown up in Montesano, a small logging town in the southwestern corner of the state. His father was the town jeweler and watchmaker. Bob was a small, asthmatic kid who topped out at 5'7", but he never let that get in his way. If he got knocked down, he picked himself back up. In high school, he lettered in, wait for it, basketball. His father never revealed his Jewish heritage to him until a few days before he left for Germany. They were a young crew, those boys. Of the 8 oarsmen, pitted against the best in the world, 5 were juniors and 3 were only sophomores. So, now that you have a better idea who these boys were, let's watch them race. This is a clip from Leni Riefenstahl's movie, Olympia. This is the 8-oar finals.
Die Entscheidung im Achter. Schweiz, Ungarn, England, Amerika, Italien und Deutschland. Zum ersten Mal bei den Olympischen Spielen hat sich ein deutscher Achter bis zur Entscheidung durchgekämpft. Italien kommt auf. Deutschland greift an. Deutschland holt auf. Zieht gleich. Die Wikinger gehen in Führung. Der Endkampf ist entbrannt. Die letzten 100 Meter, das deutsche Boot im Vordergrund. Daneben mit weißem Stirntuch die Italiener. Dahinter die Ungarn, neben diesen England. Auf der Außenbahn aber führt Amerika. Deutschland kommt auf. Meter um Meter. Zu spät, zu spät. Amerika hat gesiegt. Erster Amerika. Zweiter Italien. Dritter Deutschland.
Many people who have read and loved The Boys in the Boat have commented that they wish there were more. So one thing I'm going to do today is tell you some stories that didn't make it into the book and some stories of life after rowing. It is perhaps easy to dismiss whatever positive influences Harry, Joe's dad, had on his life, but they were there. At one point in Squim, Joe found a bee tree and he rushed back to his father all excited to cut the tree down and get the honey. But Harry told him they needed to wait, that everything had its own timing and the tree shouldn't come down until fall when the bees had made all the honey possible for the year. Patience and timing, those things stuck with him. Again in Squim, when Joe was about 13, he was fiddling with the carburetor in the 26 Franklin, practicing tuning up the car, when something flipped over or dropped off and the engine began racing uncontrollably. Joe was frantic. He couldn't fix the problem no matter what he tried to do. He was sure the engine was going to explode and it would be his fault. In the meantime, his father calmly walked out of the shop, leaned in through the window and turned off the ignition key. Yeah. Another lesson that stuck with Joe. Don't look for the answer in just one place. Think outside the box. One time at the Gold and Ruby Mine, Harry was talking to Joe about the problem of sawdust building up outside the mill. Joe would have been about 9, and I'm sure his father was encouraging him to think about creative solutions for problems. Joe's suggested solution was to use one of the high-powered mining hoses to wash the sawdust down into Boulder Creek. Harry let him try it. Apparently it worked pretty slick, although if the EPA had been around in the 20s, they might have had a problem with it. And in reality, although Dad had been abandoned in Squim, he wasn't alone. For almost any venture he set out on, Harry Secor was by his side, his partner in the hayfields, his partner in the not quite legal endeavors like the gaffing of salmon and exchanging the liquor a bootlegger left with dandelion wine of their own making. And when there was haying to be done, Dad and Harry could count on work because they were the best haying team in the valley. And when it wasn't haying season, Charlie McDonald's family opened their doors. Dad would work with Charlie, felling and preparing giant cottonwoods for the pulp mills in exchange for evening meals. One of Dad's most poignant memories was when he one day ran across a large amount of watercress in a stream, and he brought it to Charlie's wife, Pearl, and asked her if she'd like to use it for a salad. Dad said it really choked him up that not only did she take the watercress gladly and serve some of it for dinner that night, but she took a large tub filled with water down to the irrigation ditch and put the rest of the watercress in the tub, keeping it moist and cool for salads for several more nights. For as often as he had been exiled, scorned, or rejected, the simple act of valuing something that he had offered touched him deeply. And of course, always in his corner was Mom, Joyce Simdars. No matter what his circumstances, she always stood by his side. Which brings me to memories of music and dancing in Squim. As you may remember, my grandmother went along on all of Mom and Dad's dates while they were in Squim. And often things would go a little askew. There was the night the lights quit in the Franklin, and Mom had to stand on the running board holding a flashlight while Dad drove. There was the night the car quit partway home, and Grandma and Mom had to push while Dad steered. What? I guess neither of them knew how to steer a car. There was the time the Franklin refused to start after a dance, and they all had to walk home in the freezing weather, Dad carrying his banjo and Mom in her dancing shoes, with Grandma trudging along behind. Oh, but the dance I would love to have seen was the night Dad got carried away with his irreverent sense of humor. As usual, he was in the band for the first half of the dance to earn admission to the second half. And as he was singing Shine On Harvest Moon, for some reason he felt compelled to alter the chorus, which is supposed to go like this. Shine on, harvest moon, up in the sky. I ain't had no lovin' since January, February, June, or July. But knowing absolutely where Mom was in the crowd, he sang it like this. Shine on, harvest moon, up in the sky. I ain't had no lovin' much since January, February, June. Well, Mom went beet red, alternately mortified and laughing, and the crowd on the dance floor hooted. I asked her if she let him dance with her after that, and she said, of course. I never heard what Grandma thought. People often ask, what was your dad like as a father? I think that can best be illustrated by examples. When we were small, Seattle used to get a lot more snow. And as soon as a snowstorm hit, Dad would haul all the kid sleds down from the crawl space above the garage. But what we really waited for was Saturday, because if the snow held, Dad would get out the bobsled. This was a huge old homemade contraption with a wooden seat about 8 feet long and 2 sets of wide wooden runners which would go over pretty much any kind of snow. The runners in the back were fixed, and the runners in the front could rotate. And Dad would sit in the front and jam his feet on the back of those rotating runners, and he could steer by straightening one leg or the other. And for those of us who were piled on behind, we would either hang on for dear life to the person in front of us or grab the handrails beside the seat. There was a spectacular snowstorm in January of 1950. And over the weekend, we practically ran the runners off that bobsled. My brother Fred and I were 8 and 6 that winter, and my little brother Jerry was almost 2 and spent most of his time in a box, either being pulled or riding in front of one of us on our little sleds. And when Dad took the bobsled down the hills, we had Jerry in the box, wedged between Dad's knees and us kids behind him. But this particular storm dropped enough snow that Dad had a really great and exciting idea. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Lake Forest Park, but Perkins Way was a narrow, continuously winding road which had a steady downhill slope for about a mile. Dad had to drive the car towing the bobsled, but first thing you know, there we were, poised at the top of Perkins Way. Well, Mom would put her foot down about Jerry in the box taking the ride. But for the rest of us, with Dad in the front and a pile of us behind him, we were ready for the thrill of our lives. And down that hill we started, with the bobsled steadily picking up speed. And as we went whizzing through the curves, we started to hear an eerie rumbling sound that the faster that sled went, the louder the sound got, until it seemed like our world consisted of nothing but that sound and the wind, and our hair was flying back, and our noses were freezing, and our eyes were tearing up, and everything was just a blur. And when we finally coasted to a stop at the bottom of the hill, we knew that never, ever in our lives would we ever do anything that exciting again. And we didn't. I don't recall that Dad ever took that bobsled down Perkins Way again. I suspect Mom might have had something to do with that too. One of the things Dad would do for our birthdays when we were kids was to create a sort of a scavenger hunt for our birthday present. He would wrap and hide a present and then write a series of age-appropriate poems, each one a clue that led you to the next clue and eventually to your present, which might have been in the oven or up in the attic or maybe out in the garage or up in your brother's tree house. When I got into high school, through a series of odd events, I wound up with an unbroken 6-month-old horse. Not knowing the least thing about horse training, I immediately joined a 4-H club and got several books on how to train a horse. And one of the books touted the benefits of teaching your horse to pull a cart, because it could be done while the horse was still too young to ride. Of course, I promptly showed Dad a picture of a horse hitched to a training cart and said, "I need one of these to do the job right." I never thought about how he would do it, but not much time passed before an amazing replica of a training cart made with plumbing pipes and elbows and lightweight motorcycle wheels and various hand-carved wood pieces appeared. Turned out my horse disliked pulling anything and often would go on bucking sprees, which made short work of the wooden shaft poles. However, Dad was up to the challenge, and there progressively appeared an ever larger pile of replacement shafts for whenever I came leading the horse home with a busted cart dragging behind us. He never complained. He'd just shake his head and replace the shafts. That's the kind of dad he was. Someone adventurous, creative, patient, and unfailingly supportive of our passions. When I graduated from the University of Washington, yes, I did, class of 65. Woo! I landed a job at Boeing. As it happened, Dad also worked at Boeing, and my job was at the same plant he was working in, so I could ride in his carpool. Dad had always had a carpool that he drove for as long as I can remember, and many of his riders stayed with him for their entire time at the company. And one of those riders was a lady named Shirley. Shirley was a formidable-looking single lady with a distinctive Brooklyn accent who lived with her mother. I suppose she wasn't more than 40 at the time, but to a girl of 21, she seemed a lot older than that. And she had one real weakness. She could not resist betting with Dad. Could not, no matter how stupid the subject. Dad had a can on the car floor that he'd punched a slotted hole into, a Metrocal can, I think, that anytime he won a bet with Shirley, she had to pony up a quarter. Not sure what he ever did with that money. I never saw her win a bet, except that once. She would bet on anything. A car was driving slowly in front of us, and she would say something like, "Probably an old man with a pipe." And Dad would say, "I think it's a woman." And she would say, "Want to bet?" And Dad would say, "You're on," and work his way up beside the car. Well, it was never the old man with a pipe, so out would come the quarter. Ka-ching! She would say, "It's cloudy everywhere today." He would say, "Probably not cloudy over Squim." She would say, "Want to bet?" He would say, "You're on." And eventually we'd get far enough south that we could see the skyline over the Olympic Peninsula. Ka-ching! As I said, she could not resist. But the real classic, the one I always think about when the month of May comes around, happened about midway through the month. The weather had been cold and miserable, and hardly a day had passed that it hadn't rained. And one morning Shirley grumbled her way into the car and said, "It's never going to warm up." Dad, "Oh, it'll hit 90 before the end of the month." Shirley, "Want to bet?" Dad, "You're on." Well, the days drug past. Cold days, wet days, and even if the sun peeked out for a while, we never got up to 70. And finally came the end of the last week. May 31st was on a Sunday, and so on Friday, when Shirley got into the car, smiling, Dad graciously handed her a 50-cent piece. I thought it was over. He had never flinched, but he had lost the bet. However, through some anomaly of nature, Sunday the 31st dawned clear, and the temperature shot up and surpassed 90 degrees. And the next day, when Dad pulled up at our driveway, Shirley came flouncing out of her house, slammed her body into the car, shoved a silver dollar into the Metro-Cal can, and loudly said, "It'll be a cold day in May before I ever bet with you again." Dad's face remained absolutely straight as he eased the car out of her driveway, but I could almost see the thought balloon forming over his head. Want to bet? In looking back on Dad's life, something people often ask about is, did being an Olympic medal winner change his life? That's not really the right question. The right question is, did being on crew change his life? And the answer to that is yes, profoundly. He came into the university a damaged soul, unable to trust, and he left a whole person. What may seem odd to us now, when getting Olympic gold could garner you quite a tidy living in awards and sponsorship opportunities, was that none of the guys wanted that. They were ferociously protective of their status as amateurs. In those days, one of the major opportunities for money and fame was, believe it or not, to get your face on the Wheaties cereal box. Wheaties, the breakfast of champions. Well, the guys were approached by General Mills, and to a man, they turned the offer down. They were a very humble group of guys. They put the gold medals away. They walked away from the university. They walked away from rowing. They built lives and families for themselves, but they never could walk away from the crew because their bonding as a crew was in their blood. At least twice a year for the rest of their lives they would gather, sometimes with families and sometimes just them. And every 10 years they celebrated with an anniversary row in the Clipper. I have to say that of all the accolades he received from rowing, for Dad, the most important recognition was induction into the inaugural class of the Husky Hall of Fame. That purple jacket represented the ultimate affirmation of his value to the university, his value to the crew. Which is not to say that being a gold medal winner doesn't have its perks. When Mom died in 2002, I was ordering the engraving on the marble piece for the niche wall where we would be placing her ashes in Squim. And the representative explained to me that it would make sense to also put all of Dad's information, except the date of death, on at the same time. I requested that after Mom's dates, there be etched a small rhododendron. "Oh no," the representative on the phone said. "We don't allow anything but names and dates on the niche walls." "Well," I said, "what about if after everything is engraved, I just come and paint a small rhodie beside the dates?" "Oh no," he said, "we can't have any color. It would make things too messy." "Well," I said, thinking frantically, "that's really too bad, because my dad's probably the only gold medalist Squim ever had, and I wanted to put the Olympic rings after his name." Long pause. "What's your phone number? I'll call you back in a few minutes." About 5 minutes later, the phone rang and the representative's voice asked, "What did you say the colors on those rings were?" And I said, "Does this mean my mom gets her rhododendron?" Dad may have been humble, but I was never above name dropping. And so, on June 4th of 2013, The Boys in the Boat was released, and we held our collective breath. We didn't know. Everyone who had read the manuscripts and raved about them was someone already prejudiced toward the story. How would it be received by people who had never even known that this had happened? And we were blown away. The book began to take on a life of its own. People laughed and wept. They read the race scenes on the edge of their seats, and when the book was over, many felt a disquieting emptiness, as though they'd been at a great party with friends and the whole scene had just evaporated. Some found it hard to read another book for a while. Many needed to reread the book or just think about it to process the journey that they had completed. And most felt that they had been given a gift that it was important to share. I've been trying to figure out what it is about The Boys in the Boat that affects people so deeply. There is, of course, the fact that on its own, it's just a great story. It's a great sports story, a great human interest story. It's got survival struggles, underdogs, a likable hero, insurmountable obstacles, self-doubt, and finally supreme trust and victory. And through it all, the main character just keeps trudging on, conquering his world one step at a time. Second, it is the story of rowing. For those who dedicate their lives to the pain and beauty of this sport, it validates their passion. It explains, like no other book, what it is to row, what it takes to be a rower. People that row this can give this book to their non-rowing friends and say, "Read this. This is why I do it. This is what it's like." People who know someone who rows can say, "I wish I'd read this before. Now I see. Now I understand." Third, it is a true story. One of the repeating themes that we hear in the reviews were that if it weren't a true story, it would have lost people's interest because it was just too improbable to happen. And yet it did. And because of that, people have stopped to take a look at their own circumstances. If Joe could do that, maybe I could do this. Maybe things aren't as tough as I thought. Maybe there's light at the end of the tunnel. Maybe I could learn to row, reconnect with old friends, take music lessons, take a step into the unknown. The story has become a source of inspiration, even courage, to many people. But something that lies even deeper than the truth of the story is its unflinching probing into the human condition. Even if we don't recognize it at a conscious level, somewhere deep down, the truth of what is important to us as humans vibrates throughout our souls. And the book lets us stop and take a look deep down and remember what things in life are really important. We see trust and sacrifice and longing for home and love and suffering and redemption and honor and grief and joy, and our hearts swell and tears come to our eyes because those are the things that lie at the heart of what it is to be human. I expect that maybe the reason the response to the book has been so intense is that in this age of me first, it's all your fault, you're wasting my time, I can't get everything done, I can't get anything done, when can I breathe? This may be the first time that people have ever touched those feelings, and it startles them, and it washes over them, and they realize that they've just experienced something important, even if they don't fully understand it, because what they have experienced is a look into what we can be like when we are at our best, and it changes them. Kind of like it changed Dad, I guess, because in the end, the boy who had been totally disposable to his family, the boy who had vowed never to trust again, found a home. I once asked Dad why he kept coming back to crew, to all that pain and crushing effort. I expected him to say it was because he needed the job the university provided for crew members. But that's not what he said. What he said was simply, they needed me. Thank you.